I always like to start with a reminder of what our budget is really about. Our vision of prosperity, the vision of most Oklahomans, involves one where we have a well-educated, well-trained workforce, well-functioning infrastructure, healthy communities, safe neighborhoods, and support for our families and neighbors in need. All of these components of a thriving state depend in part on proper funding of state and local government. That's not to say at all that government is the only sector that's important here. We also need, of course, the private sector, nonprofits, foundations, churches, families, and of course, think tanks. But we do depend on government being a strong and effective partner if we're going to reach our goals as a state. So let's now turn to a few of the fiscal fundamentals, a few of the basics about budget and tax that we should keep in mind as we're looking at policy debates. The first fact, which I always want to remind people, is that Oklahoma is a low-tax state. However you measure it, Oklahomans pay among the lowest taxes in the nation. The average Oklahoman pays about 1/4 less per capita in taxes than the national average, and about $1.60 less of every $100 in state personal income than does the average American. Next important point, if you look at our combined state and local taxes, we have a fairly balanced three-legged stool of sales, property, and income taxes. By national standards, we're a little heavy on sales tax and a little light on property taxes, but we do rely on a broad and diverse mix of taxes to fund state and local services. If we look just at state taxes, it's notable that while we collect dozens of different taxes, alphabetically from the aircraft excise tax to the workers' compensation premium tax, just 6 of those taxes account for about 85% of revenue, or 6 out of every state dollars collected in state taxes. Those are the personal income tax, general sales tax, gross production tax, motor vehicle tax, motor fuels tax, and corporate income tax. The largest of those taxes is the personal income tax, which accounts for 1 out of every $3 that was collected in state taxes in 2013. But income tax collections have sagged in the past decade. This is due in part to tax cuts, in part to the effects of the recession of 2009-2010. We actually saw income tax collections begin to flatten out in 2008, which was prior to the recession. Now you'll hear that Oklahoma cut taxes in the mid-2000s and tax collections grew. That is true that they did grow, but they grew considerably less than they would have without the tax cuts. And when you look at the personal income taxes going flat, that's a pretty strong indicator of that. Next tax to mention is the gross production tax, or severance tax on oil and gas. Gross production tax revenues are typically the 3rd largest of the state taxes, but those fluctuate quite a bit, and in 2013, gross production taxes actually fell to 5th. That was in part due to low natural gas prices that year, and in part due to the growing cost of tax breaks for horizontal drilling and some deferred tax rebates that were paid out in 2013 as well. As I mentioned, we are somewhat light in property taxes. In fact, we are a very low property tax state. It is an important reminder when Oklahoma is compared to Texas. Texas may not have an income tax, but their property taxes are 2 to 3 times higher than Oklahoma's. In fact, the average resident of our 6 neighboring states pays 2 to 3 times as much on average in property tax as does the average Oklahoman. Another important and often overlooked point is that state and local taxes are regressive. That means that low and moderate income families pay a higher share of their income in state and local taxes than do wealthier households. Recently, the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy put out an updated version of their report called Who Pays, which provided some concrete numbers on that. The ITEP report showed that those in the bottom fifth of households by income, those with family income below $18,000 a year, on average pay 10.5% of their total income in state and local taxes. By comparison, those in the top 1% with incomes over $415,000 a year, on average paid 4.3% of their income in state and local taxes. The regressivity of our overall state and local tax system is mostly due to the sales tax, because low and moderate income people pay more of their income in taxable goods. We do have a slightly progressive income tax, but that's more than offset by the regressivity of the sales tax. And yet, over the past decade, we've gone back year after year to cutting the top income tax rate, which makes the overall tax system even more regressive. I'll have more to say about the budget in a later section, but one fundamental is that the 9 out of every 10 state appropriated dollars go to just 10 state agencies, all of which are in the core areas of government of education, health, human services, public safety, and transportation. If you take all the other 65 or so appropriated agencies, together they divide up just 1 out of every $10. That includes the tax commission, the 3 branches of government, all the regulatory agencies, the health department, veteran care facilities, and more. As a result, when you face big budget shortfalls and you are forced to look at cuts, you simply can't avoid making cuts to the core state agencies. So that's a few of the fiscal fundamentals. I want to talk a little bit about the structural deficit, or the fiscal gap. The budget challenges that we are facing this year in 2015 and looking ahead to 2016 are not one-off problems. It's increasingly clear that Oklahoma has a structural budget deficit, meaning that our tax system isn't generating enough revenue in good times as well as bad times to pay for the cost of covering essential public services. There we go. If you look back less than a decade ago, in almost every year, we were generating surpluses, meaning that there was some additional money to invest in some new spending, whether it was pay raises for teachers and state employees, cost of living adjustment for retirees, expanding health care for low-income children, or other things. But even a decade ago, it was clear that these surpluses were going to disappear and that we were headed towards a structural deficit. This was because of various factors, primarily demographic factors, with the aging and impending retirement of the baby boom generation. Kent Olson, a professor of economics at Oklahoma State University, who I think is with us today, he showed the structural deficit in a paper he produced for the state chamber in the mid-2000s. By 2013, we were already heading into negative territory according to his projections. Then the legislature compounded the trouble with short-term tax policies that completely disregarded the long-term consequences and the long-term fiscal outlook. So take a look at what's happened to us over the past 15 years. Look particularly at the blue line, which measures state tax collections as a share of total state personal income. For over 2 decades, that blue line fluctuated very narrowly within a very narrow band. State tax collections were consistently between 7 and 7.5% of state personal income. As the economy grew, so did state tax collections, with the one exception in the mid-1980s when oil prices collapsed. Today, that's different. Taxes began to decline as a share of personal income with the recession of 2001. So that line began to fall with the recession of 2001, recovered some in the mid-2000s, and then fell sharply again starting in 2006, several years before the recession and just as we began to slash the income tax. Even with the current recovery, our tax collections are at less than 6% of state personal income. They're not keeping pace with the increased cost of providing services. When we talk about the structural deficit, tax cuts are a key component that have made some of the inevitable long-term trends even more stark. Tax cuts in the mid-2000s that were enacted were large, permanent, and backloaded. They were mostly enacted between 2004 and 2006, but their full fiscal impact only took effect in 2009 and 2010, just as it happened as we were being slammed by the recession. As a reminder, during that period, we cut the top income tax rate, which had been just under 7%. We cut it to 5.5% and then further to 5.25%. We also increased the standard deduction and indexed it to the federal rate, which is actually a more progressive tax cut. We exempted more retirement income, we exempted capital gains. Most of the cuts were to the income tax, but there were also, we did away with the estate tax, expanded property tax exemptions, and so on. So these were major tax cuts. Along with the tax cuts, tax breaks have taken a big toll. Recently, Oklahoma Watch did a story where they showed that the cost of business tax breaks more than doubled just between 2010 and 2014. Numerous tax breaks increased, but far and away, the largest growth was in the cost of the tax break for horizontal drilling, which we just recently found out hit over $375 million during this current fiscal year, taxing horizontal drilling at 1% for 4 years rather than at the standard 7% rate. But you also see here, if you can see the print at the back, the investment new jobs credit, the quality jobs program, tax breaks for zero emission facilities or wind power, the manufacturing ad valorem exemption, all those grew as well. And we will be having, this afternoon's panel will be looking specifically at that and what we may be able to do about it. There are several other components of the structural deficit, which I won't go into in great detail. An outdated tax system is certainly one of them. We have a sales tax that is based on the taxation of goods when we're increasingly a service-based economy, that we are increasingly an online economy, but we have all kinds of obstacles from collecting taxes from online sales. The corporate income tax, there have been all kinds of tax avoidance techniques. On the spending side, rising healthcare costs is a big driver of budget costs, even though we have made some progress in recent years. On the pension issue, we've done a much better job of getting our pension liabilities under control, but that does require putting more money into our pension obligations. And our growing inmate population, mass incarceration, is definitely one of the drivers as well. So overall, structural deficit means that in good times and in bad, we are not keeping pace. This means we need long-term thinking if we are to avoid lurching from crisis to crisis. So let me say a bit about where we've been in recent years. And that picture is supposed to be, it's a couple of hands climbing out of the hole. We're almost, but not quite there. During the downturn, revenue collections were hammered. We saw general revenue collections fall by nearly 25% between 2008 and 2010. We have climbed back up for a few years, but over the last 2 years, taxes to the general revenue fund have been flat, and we are still 6% from where we were 6 or 7 years ago. State appropriations this year are just under $7.2 billion, which is almost unchanged, basically 1% above where we were in 2009. But since that time, our population has grown, our school enrollment has grown, and inflation has taken a toll since then. So here's the same numbers adjusted for inflation. And if you adjust for inflation, this year's budget, 2015, is almost $700 million less than we were in 2009. In 2014 dollars, most appropriated state agencies remain 20 to 35% below where they were before the recession. To look at some specific areas of government, and I won't go through all of them, but we've heard, of course, a lot about education funding problems. Since 2008, state support for schools through the state aid formula has decreased by $175 million. We were down by over $230 million, but there have been some increases in the past 2 years, but we're still way behind. At the same time, the number of public school students has increased by 45,000 students. And if you look at weighted students, which takes into account such factors as poverty, disabilities, and English language learners, school enrollment has increased by close to 90,000 students during the same period. So you can see the lines have moved in very different directions. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a group we work with closely in Washington, has looked at national data on state support for education, and for each of the last 2 years, they've reported that since the downturn, Oklahoma has cut state support for education by the most of any state in the nation. Adjusted for inflation, per pupil funding in Oklahoma is down 23% since 2008. And of course, we were already starting from a low expenditure baseline. Oklahoma funds education at one of the lowest levels in the nation. According to the best national data, we are 49th in total per pupil expenditures and also 49th in expenditures on instruction and salaries. It's not just public schools that have felt the strain of underfunding. The entire state workforce remains 7% smaller than it was in 2009, and smaller even than it was in 2001. In some areas, productivity growth and efficiencies allow fewer people to get the work done, and that's a good thing. But when your population grows every year, over time, that means that more restaurants and nursing homes need to be inspected. More legal disputes need to be resolved. More business permits need to be issued. At some point, a shrinking workforce simply can't keep up. This has been most striking, perhaps, in our correction system. We keep locking more people up, but we aren't allocating the money to pay enough people to look over our incarcerated population properly. It's hard to deny that we're in a crisis. Recently, House Speaker Jeff Hickman said, "As of today, your state prisons are at 116% capacity and are staffed at about 60% of where they should be. That's a crisis. If we don't address this ourselves, we are one lawsuit away, one federal judge and federal court order away from someone other than the people you elect deciding how you operate corrections." A pretty grim, but I think a pretty compelling reminder. We could add many more areas to this list of where Oklahoma has a long and urgent list of unmet needs and pent-up demands. The one I'll mention is families of persons with developmental disabilities on a waiting list for waiver services through the Department of Human Services. The waiting list stands at just under 7,000 people, And though we have put another $1 million a year into the program in recent years, that's just enough to keep the waiting list from growing ever larger. It has remained at 7,000 people, and families who are now getting served have been on that list since 2006, 9 years. So let me ask two questions. What does it say about our priorities when we've cut taxes by almost $1 billion, but we have a 9-year waiting list for home and community-based services for those with severe disabilities? And when have we shrunk government so much that it can no longer perform the responsibilities that the people of Oklahoma expect and deserve? So looking ahead, I can only quote that noted political theorist, Scooby-Doo. The good news is that despite what's going on in the oil sector, I'll have more to say about that in a moment, so far our economy and our budget are holding up pretty well. And we'll have more of a discussion about this in the next panel. So far in fiscal year 2015, we're halfway through, 6 months in, and revenue collections are off to a good start. We're up about 7% from last year. We're above the certified estimate. I think there's a good chance that we will make it through this year without budget shortfalls, and we are at the highest post-recession levels. But still, general revenue collections, which are the largest fund for state government, they are still below where it was 8 years ago. Taking a look at oil prices, the Board of Equalization certified, had an initial certification for next year's budget in December. At the time, the FY 2016 budget forecasts were based on projections of oil averaging just under $60 a barrel next year, and natural gas being at just under $4 MCF. Since then, prices have fallen considerably lower. Right now, as of yesterday, we are at about $44.85 for a barrel of oil, about $2.84 MCF. So there is some reason to fear that the forecast for next year is too optimistic, and we will hear more about that from Dr. Rickman and others on the next panel. If you look at next year's certification, most everybody will have heard that we're facing a $300 million shortfall. If you look actually at the forecast for general revenue, they're actually showing an increase of general revenue of about $100 million. The projections are for tax revenues to grow some next year, even with the lower forecasts on oil and gas. The big factor here, if you look at the second set of lines, this year's budget included a little over $400 million in one-time revenues. About $230 million was in cash reserves and in prior year general revenue. And then there was $230 million that was transferred over, about $190 million that was transferred over from some 30 agency revolving funds. Subsequently, 2 of those transfers from the Trauma Care Fund and from the Oklahoma's Promise Higher Ed scholarships were declared by the Attorney General to be unconstitutional. So one of the big issues for this year, particularly when the governor gives her budget speech next week, is how much money will they attempt to transfer out of agency revolving funds to begin to bring this year's budget into balance. The other component of this year's budget are tax cuts. Because tax collections are expected to rise, it was enough to trigger a drop in the top income tax rate that was approved by last year's legislature. So as of January 1st, 2016, the top income tax rate will drop from 5.25 to 5.0%. The trigger mechanism was supposed to be a responsible approach to cutting taxes. Since they couldn't balance the last year's budget if the tax cut took effect right away, they pushed it off to 2016 and made it contingent on a trigger. But of course, there was no real forecast of what our budget outlook for 2016 would look like. Now we have a tax cut kicking in and a $300 million shortfall. So we're talking about a $300 million shortfall, but in important ways that strongly underestimates the situation, because in various areas of state government, there's additional money needed just to preserve programs and services where they are, or to address some very urgent priorities. So this Department of Education has submitted a budget request for next year asking for $297 million. Of that, $15 million is for health benefit allowances that has to be taken care of. They've asked for $52 million to try to restore some of the cuts to the state aid formula, and then $215 million for a $2,000 or maybe $2,500 teacher pay raise. That request was developed under Superintendent Barisi, and Superintendent Hoffmeister has essentially continued to promote that. In healthcare, the Medicaid agency says it's going to need $160 million for various priorities. Much of that is simply to make up for loss in federal funds and growth in the program. Department of Mental Health, $10.2 million, also due to lost federal matching funds and to preserve certain programs. Corrections has asked for $85 million to deal with increases in their inmate population and to provide some desperately needed staffing increases and pay raises. DHS continues to have faced with the obligations of the Pinnacle Plan for Child Welfare, where the most recent reports from the co-neutral said that the agency is not meeting the court-mandated goals. So they, in fact, may need more than $16 million. That is not a full list, but that is, even if we had revenue growth, even if we had expectations of $200 or $300 million in growth, there would be fierce competition for those scarce demands. We're starting with a shortfall of $300 million. It is certainly going to be a huge, huge challenge. We've already been asked some about the Rainy Day Fund. I just wanted to throw in one slide about that. Rainy Day Fund is at a healthy amount of $535 million. Most of that Rainy Day Fund could not be accessed this year based on the restrictions on the fund. Up to a quarter of the Rainy Day Fund, which is about $134 million, could be appropriated for fiscal 2016 upon declaration of an emergency, which requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature if the governor declares the emergency, or a 3/4 vote without the governor. So I wish I could say I've painted a rosy picture here, but I do think it's really worth being serious about the obstacles. Do want to conclude with some suggestions, proposals of what we could do. The first thing is to avoid further income tax cuts without some clear understanding of what our budget situation is and how we would continue to pay for services if we choose to cut further. Curbing unnecessary tax breaks, that's going to be a discussion this afternoon. There's a lot of business tax breaks that will certainly get a lot of scrutiny. There's also some individual income tax breaks that are worth considering. For example, Oklahoma is one of the few states that provides a state income tax deduction for your state income taxes. It's a double deduction that provides no clear public policy purpose, and it's about an $80 to $100 million deduction that could be addressed without causing great pain on anybody. We hope that will be on the table. Combined corporate reporting is a way that many states have tried to eliminate some of the practices where businesses avoid tax liability by shifting income to states without a corporate income tax. Modernizing the sales tax could involve both expanding the sales tax base to certain services that are currently untaxed, consumed by households, also by doing more to collect the taxes that are owed on online sales. And then certainly going forward, if there are going to be any further tax cuts, prioritize those tax cuts for those who are in greatest need of relief, whether it is the sales tax on groceries or indexing the personal exemption or indexing the lower tax brackets. There are things that you could do that would actually help make the tax system a little bit fairer and more progressive. I want to conclude by mentioning this year we are going to be working in coalition with many other organizations here through a group that we lead called Together Oklahoma. We have developed 6 priorities, which on this slide says priorities for 2105. That was a typo. It may have been a Freudian typo. It may indicate our recognition that these are long-term priorities that may take us the next 89 years or so to actually implement. In your packets, you have a one-page summary of the 6 priorities. And then on the Together Oklahoma website, we have one-pagers on each of those at togetherok.org. But just quickly, we're going to be working to restore education funding, to expand health coverage by accepting federal funds that are being offered to cover low-income adults, curb unnecessary tax breaks, get smarter on crime by addressing some of the policies that are leading to too many people being imprisoned and putting too many barriers on those who are getting out of prison. One issue that we will likely hear more about is a national movement for a constitutional convention for a balanced budget amendment. Many folks are very concerned about what a constitutional convention could involve and what a balanced budget amendment would do, and we're going to be working on that. And then finally, I think very few of our problems are going to be addressed if we continue to live in a state where 2 out of every 3 eligible citizens don't even vote. And there are some sensible proposals out there this session being sponsored by legislators from both parties. Senator David Holt from Oklahoma City, Senator Randy Bass from Lawton, and others are looking at ways to get more people to vote through online voter registration, extended early voting, all mail-in elections down the road, other things as well that hopefully will get more people engaged and active on these issues, because it's really going to take all of you and many, many more others if we're going to make progress towards those goals. All of our information is available online. I hope that you will use this and you can download the presentation. If you feel like your organization should hear this, please reach out to us. My staff and I would love to come and talk to you. So with that, I will wrap up, and I think we may have 5 minutes for a couple of questions. And I don't know, do we have microphones set up? I think there are microphone stands up there. I'm looking to see. Yeah, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions if somebody wants to. And I'm having a problem. Do we have the stands up there? Okay. Anybody? Okay, yes.
I'm wondering, you didn't mention the funding for higher education. How has that fared over
Yeah.
the last 5 or 6 years?
Good question. I have a longer version of this, which does include the higher education slide. In fact, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities also did a report on higher education funding, which shows that on a per student basis, higher education has actually been cut more than common education. Adjusted for inflation, state support in Oklahoma has been cut about 27% over the last 5 years. The difference, there's 2 differences between higher education and common education. One is Oklahoma is less of an outlier for higher education. It's typical, most states have cut funding for higher ed since the downturn. The other difference is that higher education does have more alternatives to appropriations as ways to raise revenue, particularly through tuition increases as well. So I don't know that higher education has felt the crunch as bad, but certainly cuts have hurt. And this year, higher education has put forward a budget request of somewhere between $80 and $90 million, largely to try to implement the college completion goals that the regent and the governor and others have developed. And they are certainly looking for money, or at least to avoid taking deeper cuts. Last year, there was a $50 million cut to higher education that was on the agenda that was averted over the course of the session. One more question, and then we will call up the panelists for our next session. Anybody? Yes, in the back, and speak up. Oh, and there's a microphone.
If you could wave the magic wand, and there are 3 or 4 things that you think the legislature should do that are reasonable this session, and the governor sign, what would they be?
Not being in, well, so 3 or 4 things. I would defer the tax cut, which I didn't go through all the numbers. That's $50 million this year, $150 million next year, $267 million at least if the second part of the tax cut determined last year is implemented or takes effect in 2018. So it's a $250 million tax cut. You know, the biggest opportunity for new revenue was on the tax breaks for horizontal drilling. We had a big fight on that last session and lost, and there's just really very little that can be done there. There are some other tax credits that do deserve to be looked at, and hopeful that there may be some opportunities. I would look at, as I mentioned, the double deduction for state income tax. Basically, the federal government allows you to deduct your state income tax from your federal taxes. Oklahoma lets you carry that over. So you're actually deducting your state income tax from your state income tax. That's one that has been part of some tax reform packages before. I think that should be looked at. I think that there are some opportunities for savings on criminal justice reform. I think if we were to expand Medicaid this year, we would save a substantial amount in the first couple of years, particularly when there's 100% federal match, and we would not have to be paying with state dollars for services currently being provided through the Department of Mental Health and elsewhere. So I think that we can do some, all of these things would be not just help our one-term situation or current year situation, but have ongoing benefit in addressing some of that long-term fiscal gap. Am I optimistic about any of those proposals? I guess I got to be an optimist because I'm director of the state's other think tank. But it'll be a struggle. But really look for folks here to make the case to legislators and to your colleagues and to those in the community. And together, I hope we can make some progress.